Okay, welcome. Welcome to OTC's Constitution Day event tonight. I'm Kara Griffin. I'm co-sponsor of Politically Active, the nonpartisan student organization on campus. We are promoted to increasing political literacy on campus. It's a great goal. We have voter drives set up every week in the atrium that you're welcome to go and register to vote if you're not already. I do have a couple members of our cabinet here tonight, Cooper and Garrett. They're muted and videos off here shortly, but I did want to give a shout out to them for helping us host tonight. Of course, speaking of chat and cabinet, tonight, as I said, keep your videos off, your mic off, and towards the end of our guest speaker with our discussion with Erica, you'll see a chat box at the bottom of your screen. The very end of this, we're going to have some live Q&A, and so you will be able to chat those questions live to Erica, and then get the response, and we'll get some collaboration going with everyone. So without further ado, I do want to welcome Erica Benson of Project 28 Missouri. Erica, thank you for being here tonight.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited.
That's awesome. So tonight, of course, we're talking about the Equal Rights Amendment. Erica, what is this and why is it so important right now?
Okay, so the Equal Rights Amendment is technically the 28th Amendment, and it was first brought to Congress in 1923. So it's been a long time running, like 79 years since it's the first advocates started fighting for it. But essentially, it's the equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. That's Section 1. Section 2 gives Congress the power or the authority to enforce the Section 1. And then Section 3 says that will go into effect 2 years after ratification. So it gives states time and cities and whatnot to change their any laws they need to before it goes into effect. So that's the basics of it. And it was passed by Congress in the 1970s and sent to the states for ratification, where it stalled out after 35 states ratified. And then Congress passed basically a deadline extension to allow more states to ratify, and they never got the additional 3 states. So in the last several years, 3 more states have ratified the ERA, and now we've reached the 3/5 threshold, and 38 states have ratified the ERA.
Okay, so that was a lot of information you just threw at us right there. Let me go back to the beginning. So when you say the equal protection, I'm sure you know this, and I want to make sure the students do. In the 14th Amendment, we already have that equal protection clause, right? We have equal protection from the laws. We have equal pay acts against discriminating against pregnant women. Title IX, Title VIII, how does this really differ from what's already in the Constitution?
So that's a great question, and it's a common question. A lot of the new laws that we have in place have been and thanks to advocates that have fought to use the 14th Amendment and the Equal Protection Clause to advocate for more rights or to win court battles against sex-based discrimination. However, it does not give Congress the authority to write laws on behalf of gender equality or gender promoting gender equality. And so anytime Congress has tried to write laws of that nature, they have been struck down by the Supreme Court, saying that it's out of their jurisdiction. So although we have advanced, it's not some of those that new legislation is not rooted in a constitutional amendment that protects it and ensures that it will stay. So they can be rolled back or replaced at any time by any body of Congress.
Okay, so that's really interesting. Thank you for clarifying that. Going back to some of the procedural groundwork, you mentioned that, of course, we have 27 constitutional amendments now. This would be the 28th. And in order for it to actually be added, it would need 2/3 of Congress to support it, and then, which has happened, and then the 38 states. So recently, this year in January, Virginia became that 38th state. So why haven't we seen any movement on it becoming a constitution amendment yet?
So because of the original deadline, a lot of advocates, stopped fighting for the ERA. What was different about the Equal Rights Amendment was that the deadline was only written in the preamble language. In other constitutional amendments, going back to the 1920s, there has been usually an 8-year deadline added, sometimes 7-year, but it's been in the body of the amendment that gets ratified by the states. But with the Equal Rights Amendment, it was only in the preamble, and the states did not ratify that language. And so these additional states said, well, we still have the authority to go ahead and ratify the ERA, and they move forward with that. There's a controversy, though, because some people, including the current Department of Justice, believe that the timeline has elapsed and that it is now dead. They probably also disagree with the Equal Rights Amendment itself and what it could do for our country, but that is the argument that they are giving. So the states that most recently ratified have united under a court decision that we can talk about later. But essentially, the National Archivist has been instructed by the Department of Justice, so Attorney General William Barr, to not add it to the Constitution, even though he's written down the other recently ratified states as having ratified and that the threshold has been met.
Gotcha. Okay, so in terms of Missouri has not ratified this yet. Obviously, it's for 50 years. This hasn't been approved. What are your thoughts and emotions just knowing that this is ratified and it's been waiting 50 years?
I know. Well, and we've worked and we've fought for hearings, and I've testified at a hearing in front of the Senate Rules Committee in Missouri, and it's really frustrating when you have all these advocates that have, like, one of our members she died in the midst of this. She had cancer and died and never got to see it come to fruition, but she's been there fighting her whole life for this. So we're asking them to consider, how many women are really affected by this, and how many constituents they have that are women. And it's very frustrating because they just choose to ignore it, and it continues not to advance despite our efforts and rallies and lobbying and everything else. But it is still bipartisan in Missouri, and there are some Republicans who've co-sponsored. And the fact that we were even able to get a hearing was a good sign, and be able to have meetings with the Speaker of the House and other leadership. They know we're here, but we need more education and collective action to require more demand on behalf of people. But at this point, Missouri's not really necessary to ratify. We tried to pressure them that we could have been the historic state. We could have been the 38th state, and that was of no interest to those legislators. And so here we are, and we don't want to be the last. But they're choosing to be on the wrong side of history in this situation.
Sure. How recently were you engaging legislators on this?
Well, 2019, we had a really strong push, and it died in the Senate Rules Committee. We were one vote short of having it brought to the full Senate, but it went nowhere in the House. It would have been really difficult for it to go anywhere in the House, especially because leadership didn't support it. But we continue to press on, but because the committees didn't change, it was hard for our bill sponsors to spend as much time on it this year. And Senator Shoup is running for office, so she's one of our bill sponsors. So we focused on educating the cities and the people that live with representatives that are up for either re-election or a new, based on term limits, they're going to be a new race, and to try to educate people to vote for people who support equality.
And this is the mission of your group, Project 28. Is this what your mission is to do, is just to promote this? Tell us a little bit about your group.
Yeah, so initially we're founded in Kansas City, and we have membership in Missouri and in Kansas, and we created a coalition across the state of Missouri of advocates that support the Equal Rights Amendment. And we are also members. We are a lead organization in the National ERA Coalition. And so we not only work with Vote Equality, which is the Virginia grassroots campaign, started a national campaign now that Virginia is ratified. So we basically work with other grassroots organizations around the country to coordinate our action, because at this point, a lot of the ERA is in the hands of Congress again, because if Congress could extend the deadline in the 70s, it can now eliminate the deadline. And so we've been working together with all the organizations across the country to not only vote for, especially senators, to get senators who support the Equal Rights Amendment into office, but then to pressure those who are currently there to support it. So this last year, there was a lot of behind the scenes work to get HJ Res 79 passed in the House. And then, so now the House has passed the elimination deadline, or the bill that eliminates the deadline on the ERA. And there's an identical bill in the Senate that is currently stuck in the Senate Judiciary Committee that Lindsey Graham chairs. And it's also stalled out there. But if, you know, that's our best hope forward right now, is to get the Senate to pass that.
Okay. And I know another problem that the ERA has ran into is, you know, concerning those 38 states that have ratified. Recently, wasn't there some language and brought to light that 5 had actually rescinded that? Can that even happen? Can a state do that and just take it back? What are the legal implications of that? Does that mean it's not actually, you know, have enough support to be an amendment?
So right now, that's another great question. Right now, and there were some states that tried to rescind in the era of Phyllis Schlafly and Stop ERA that had ratified, and they're like, oh, well, what's this? So no rescission has ever been accepted in the past, because at other times, some states tried to rescind the 14th Amendment or the 15th Amendment or even the 19th Amendment, and that has never been accepted in the past. Now, it's never been seen by the Supreme Court. So at some point they may take up a case concerning that, concerning rescissions. But if you look at the 18th Amendment, you know, everybody didn't just rescind their 18th Amendment ratification and say, okay, we take that back. We don't want prohibition anymore. Instead, a new amendment had to be created that people ratified to end prohibition. So I think that might be the best example of how there's no process written in the Constitution for how a rescission might work. It's almost like you sign a contract and you can't unsign it. But people continue to try to sign it in our situation. Like, the time hasn't run out.
Right. So Virginia becoming the 38th state this year, and of course, one of the most popular Supreme Court judges, Judge Ginsburg, who's probably America's most feminist icon, she actually shot down the ERA being officially ratified into the Constitution. What does she have to say, and why do you think she had that opinion?
So for Justice Ginsburg, the ERA is the #1 constitutional amendment she'd like to see in her lifetime. And when she was quoted talking about that, that was before Congress had taken any action and passed HJ Res 79. So it wasn't a legal ruling, it was her speaking on a personal opinion. She has concerns about how much this will be fought, because if it is finally added to the Constitution, will Southern states try to challenge it? You know, it's going to be messy no matter what. So she was saying that she would like to see it start over again. But, you know, I don't know if I would see it happen in my lifetime if we started it over again, honestly. It's been such a challenge to get to 38. We may never see it happen, and it would be devastating.
What do you think it's going to take for Missouri to ratify?
Shame. They don't want to be like Mississippi or Alabama. And, you know, I think if some more, I mean, ultimately it should be bipartisan, and people that continue to, you know, misconstrue what the ERA is about, those are the loudest voices that are heard, and they don't want to disrupt that base. And I think if it became law and it was less scary and those things didn't happen, then they'd be like, oh, of course, I have always supported the ERA. No problem. And then they would try to ratify it.
Gotcha. So kind of going back to the impacts of ERA and the importance and how it would change the lenses of some of the laws now. It seems to be trying to strengthen the judicial scrutiny of how sex discrimination is analyzed in the courts and court cases. Most of our students that will be watching this are Government 101, you know, PLS 101 students. Can you put in common terms what the ERA is trying to do vis-a-vis judicial scrutiny?
So this is challenging because modern legal scholars, Dr. Julie Suk has recently written a book, and I have it here. And she is a legal scholar who is an expert and a visiting professor at Yale, who has a different take on this, which has kind of changed my perspective a little bit. But for a long time, ERA advocates were fighting for strict scrutiny for gender-based decisions, and that was, or sex-based discrimination. And that was to mean that when they were deciding a case, they would have the highest level of scrutiny. Right now, it's mostly at intermediate. Decisions are made and viewing cases, but strict scrutiny includes classifications of race, national origin, and religion. And so it would keep that of gender at the same base. So whenever you're considering a case, whether it have to do with religion or religious freedom, you would also have to look at just sex-based discrimination. Now, that a lot of new advocates and legal scholars are saying that might totally change if we had the ERA, and this might be a new starting point where we don't even really look at classifications of scrutiny, because a lot of what Congress is going to try to do is hopefully pass legislation to promote gender equality. And those laws, they won't want to be reviewed with strict scrutiny. They'll want to have more flexibility with intermediate scrutiny. So it's very complicated, and it's hard to know what's going to happen. But basically, women want to win more cases. It's right now the burden of proof is on women. A Walmart case is an example where women tried to file a class action lawsuit to say that they were underpaid and not promoted, and the Supreme Court said that they didn't have a case, and they couldn't prove that that was purposeful discrimination. So with an equal rights amendment, there would be less burden, and the expectation would be that Walmart would have to prove that it wasn't systematically, whether it was conscious or unconsciously, discriminating against its female employees.
Thank you for clarifying that. I think that's a really interesting point to keep in mind, to have that, included in those categories. Other hot button, issues and topics with the ERA. How would the ERA have any impact on abortion policy?
So this is another thing that, especially in Missouri, gets brought up a lot. This is like Missouri Right to Life fights against us constantly, because they think that this will enshrine more reproductive rights for women. And when you look at states that have their own equal rights amendments, this has not been the case. I mean, abortion is already legal in our country with Roe versus Wade and the Equal Protection Clause. So in states that have their own equal rights amendment, when cases about abortion have come up, the only time it's come up is when it has been about medical necessity. And those cases have said, well, you can't change what's medically necessary. You can't discriminate on a woman if it has to do with reproduction, a medical necessity to save her life, versus a man. So if a man, if a man's on Medicare and he's having a heart attack and Medicare pays for that because he's about to die, you can't say that you're not going to now pay for a woman who has to have an abortion because she might die. So those are the only cases that have been reviewed like that. There have been no cases seen about elective abortions. And most of the time, those cases are still reviewed using privacy and not the ERA. So again, it's fear mongering, and they're so worried. And I think a lot of people really have these high hopes about a conservative court overturning Roe versus Wade. And I think that they're worried if there's an equal rights amendment, they won't be allowed to do it. Like that the Constitution will prevent them from being able to do it because it will only impact one sex. So we don't know, what's going to happen, but I think that's their honest fear, and that maybe if abortion rights are upheld, that fear will go away again, and that the court has already determined that a woman's right to choose is fundamental, and it's already reviewed under strict scrutiny. So that's what makes it complicated. But for us, a woman, a very small percentage of women will have an abortion in their lifetime, and they're only of reproductive age for a certain window of their life. And for women to be oppressed in pay and violence and all of these challenges throughout our whole life, to hold us hostage, essentially. That's what I said in the Senate Rules Committee hearing, that you hold us hostage over a few people in a certain condition and this is a right that they already have in America. just seems like a failure. And you're letting down so many people who would benefit from this protection, and so many families, not just women, and men and families too.
What impact, if any, would it have on family law, alimony, child custody, anything like that?
It potentially could. I mean, particularly if there was gender stereotyping made in some kind of decision, and maybe a man wanted to challenge the decision made in family court, there would be, legs to stand on. But it also would have to, Congress would have to write legislation, or states would have to write more legislation on that too, and they would have the ability to do so. So it's hard to say, but the hope is that it would be fair and as equal as possible. And but there's an opportunity there to make the system better potentially.
I read that it may impact how women serve and advance in the military. Can you expand on that?
Well, it definitely, this was an original, in the wake of the Vietnam War, people were, obviously very scared of their children being drafted. And this is something that Phyllis Schlafly and her group capitalized on, and saying that your daughters will be drafted. And so people were like, oh my gosh, not my daughter, and they're already in the midst of the fear and panic from the war. So today, basically courts have determined that women are allowed to be drafted, but Congress would still write the laws about who it would be. And so I'm sure there would be exceptions about women who had young children, and even now fathers that have young children and other things. And so I don't foresee like an actual combat draft ever happening, well, knock on wood, where people are drafted to serve, but in combat. But there could be, if there was cyber warfare and we were drafted to go work on computers, and but I think a lot of women would say, well, that's our duty as Americans, and if we're capable and you're going to provide childcare, then we're going to do it.
Right. So despite the fact that this is currently not in the Constitution, but roughly half the states have state-level ERAs, can you point to a state or two that have the kind of positive impact you're describing that you would like to see at a federal level?
We've started to be able to see what's happening in California and their attempts to create gender quotas in political bodies, to experiment with that in the way that some European countries have, to promote women in places of power, where we've just continued to see huge lags behind other countries, and it just access to be able to serve in Congress, and then the type of representation and legislation that comes out and decisions that are made when there aren't women present is really detrimental. So that's one example. But a lot of states haven't. Again, you have to lobby your Congress to write that kind of legislation. So I don't think there have been as huge advancements there. But one example too is ending female genitalia mutilation. Congress tried to pass a law. They did pass a law, but it was overturned by the Supreme Court, or by a district court, because it was outside of the jurisdiction of Congress. They said the Commerce Clause has nothing to do with this, and you don't have power to write laws about gender equality, or protecting women from sex-based discrimination. So they threw it out. But states that have an ERA have been able to pass those laws to prevent FGM.
Thank you. So a big question here. Do you think, or are you of the belief that the ERA would be able to defeat sexism in America? And what impact, if this was ratified and added as a 28th Amendment, what impact do you think it would have on sexism?
I definitely wouldn't eradicate it overnight. And it's so socially ingrained in our society in many different ways. It's going to take a long time, but I do think it will make a difference, because we will be able to again have a way to lobby our legislators to say, now you have the power, and now we want you to do this. If there is a claim, or if we're talking about equal pay or sexual violence, there's going to be more ways to remedy that. And so hopefully women get better justice in various situations. And so people are going to start to change their actions. If they know they're going to be held accountable, and companies are going to be held accountable, and perpetrators are going to be held accountable, then maybe their behaviors will start to change. But it's also, I mean, America is one of the only, few, I guess, first world nations that doesn't have sex-based equality, any kind of provision in our Constitution. And every Constitution written since World War II does. And so, in some of these countries that we helped rebuild after World War II have more protections and rights for women than our own. And we helped write them. So it is kind of embarrassing on the world stage that we're not a part of this. And it's really overlooked. Like I'm a high school US history teacher, and I teach a college course too. And so many, especially male teachers, don't teach anything about the Equal Rights Amendment or the struggle for women's rights of the 70s and 80s. And this would, I mean, every person would open their textbook or, the computer or whatever, and it would say that this is an American value. This is a part of the US Constitution. This is the expectation that we uphold in our country. And I do think there will be progress made over time. And people have something to point to that says, that's not what we tolerate here. We're not about that. And, even though we have, constitutional amendments trying to prevent, and laws trying to prevent racism, we still have it. So it's not an overnight solution, but it is a start.
I want to go back to the local landscape for a minute. You said earlier that you were one vote shy of getting to the Senate. Tell me, do you feel you're at a brick wall right now with Project 28 in Missouri, or do you feel invigorated for the future days? Do you think this next election will have a better opportunity for you to have a platform? How do you feel about the local temperature of Project 28?
I mean, I think that it just depends what the landscape looks like, right? And who gets reelected or who is in power. We'll see that the super majorities probably won't change though. And that's the real challenge of getting anything like this passed, is when there's a supermajority or people are heads of committees or heads of the Speaker of the House doesn't have to put anything on the floor they don't want to. And so it's really difficult. So we're going to still try, and we're still going to push and do everything we can. A state that we work with a lot is Arizona, and we've seen such progress that they have made over time, just beating against the wall. And so we want to be like that, but we've also spent a good amount of time in Kansas trying to vote in a pro-equality candidate in the Senate. Because if we can flip the Senate, if Senator Lindsey Graham keeps it stalled in the Senate Judiciary Committee, then we need to flip the Senate, because there needs to be new leadership to appoint people to committees. And so if we can get a pro-ERA candidate in Kansas, then that's a small victory for us. And we have limited resources, and there's so many causes to care about right now. So we've turned our attention right now in this year to Kansas to try to help win that election. And then we're helping with a nationwide bus tour, essentially a quality bus tour, so we'll start in St. Louis, and we're going to go through Missouri, Kansas, to Colorado, and to other states, back to Kansas again. So, trying to do other things to educate people about why the ERA is important.
Right. So if you could tell the students, one thing that you wish that they knew that maybe we haven't discussed, or maybe you don't, get right off the first words of reading the article, what's something you wish that they knew?
I would say don't be limited by the words itself, because a lot of people say, well, don't we already have equality? Don't we already have all these things? Well, that's not what it's about. It's about opening doors to new possibilities. Like, there is so much more we could do for women that doesn't currently exist, and Congress doesn't have the authority to even think about that. So one example might be to regulate private action. So companies could have an equality index, and that you could use different measures to determine, looking at equal pay, are women being promoted after maternity leave, all these different things. And if your score was below a certain number, you could be fined by the federal government, and the expectation would be to do better. That's one example. Better equal pay legislation, childcare, national childcare. I think people realize now it was almost passed in the 1970s, but what an impact and how important childcare is for women and families in America, affordable childcare or free childcare, and the impact it will have on education and poverty in America. If kids are all going to kindergarten with a similar level of education, the gap between knowledge gap will be lessened, and women will be allowed to, work and advance more without worrying constantly about having to manage both roles in their household, and how expensive childcare is. It's crazy expensive. And the burden, there's a lot of burden on families. So it's, get creative. Imagine what you could ask your legislative bodies to do, and it could be possible.
Do you think the ERA will help to close the gender pay gap?
I honestly, I think it definitely could. I think that it would give more meat to, it's going to bring awareness. People are going to be talking about it. And, we have new equal pay legislation floating out there that hasn't been moved currently in the Senate. But things like making, being able to discuss your pay and, little things like that, or not asking somebody what their former pay was at their job, because that disproportionately hurts women. But there are a lot of things, and if we had a gender equality index, or we looked at gender mainstreaming, when we looked at, if they were going to write a law or a bill or spend money in something, they would have to consider how it would impact women and before, and, or in both sexes before they could pass it. And so just making that top of mind, like, don't forget about this, because a lot of people have ignored it, or frankly just okay with it. They're okay that women are at a different level or have a different quote unquote role to play in society. And it's all about choices, right? I mean, like, the idea is that if you, as much freedom and choice as you can possibly have without those barriers is our goal, because we're not going to tell anybody how to live their life, but we also don't want you to hold us back because you have some idea of how you want us to live.
You're such an eloquent speaker. Thank you. Let's say that there was a student watching this who was just really inspired and didn't know how to get involved or where to go. Where would you tell a student, bright, dewy-eyed student in the world, how to help with this initiative? Is it contacting a local representative? Is it joining your coalition? What is the best method for them to get involved?
So I would say, if you want to be specifically involved with the Equal Rights Amendment locally, go to Project 28 Missouri, project28mo.com, and sign up and join us and be a volunteer and work with us. If you want to learn more about the national movement and sign petitions or donate money to the lobbying efforts in the national level, the ERA Coalition, and we have links to these groups on our site that we're members of. The ERA Coalition is one to look at. Vote Equality US is another, with lots of frequently asked questions and other things like that available. But, again, the work begins when the ERA is ratified, and we're going to need coalitions of women's organizations and other women, or just organizations that care about women's equality. It shouldn't be, the burden shouldn't be so much on women. Like, where are all the men? You should care about this. But here in Kansas City, we have a women's equality coalition of various organizations, and I'm a member of, and together we can advocate for things, and we have a bigger voice and a bigger reach and a bigger platform. So if in Springfield you wanted to start some kind of coalition for people that are going to fight for this, and then talk to your representatives, which you definitely should, about this, and I think that would be amazing. It'd be huge. And we have college members. We have college. If OTC wants to become a participating member, that would be amazing. With Project 28, we work with other colleges and college students to have events. So there's a lot of opportunities. And again, I know it's so hard. There's so many things to care about right now, and there's so many crucial problems with our country and our Constitution, frankly. So this is just one of them, but I think now is the time, because if it doesn't happen now, it may never happen in our lifetimes. And those opportunities are going to be lost, because we have the hardest Constitution to ratify in the entire world, or to change. So the hardest Constitution to amend. Studies have shown we're either first or in second place most of the time every year when they do a study, but mostly we're first. The hardest Constitution to amend in the whole country. And so it's just, now is the moment.
Kind of going back to that, there's a question in the chat, and if you have questions now, please direct them in the chat so we can get those to Erica. But one of them is actually going back to Bill Barr being ordered to not add the ERA to the Constitution. We've never thought about the actual process of how it gets added. Is that how someone orders the Attorney General to slap it on the end of the Constitution? How does it actually happen?
So normally the Constitution says once the 38th state has ratified, it is now the amendment. So in Virginia and a lot of organizations, they're not even calling it the ERA anymore. They're calling it the 28th Amendment. And Virginia v. Ferreira, where we have signed an amicus brief supporting the attorneys generals of Virginia, Illinois, and Nevada, who were the last states to ratify. They have sued essentially the National Archivist to add it. They said, based on Article 5 of the Constitution, 38 states have ratified, therefore it should be added to the Constitution. And it's not his fault. He was kind of unsure on what to do. So he asked for guidance from the Department of Justice, and that's what the Department of Justice came back with. If we had a new president and a new attorney general, the advice could be different, but there's still going to be challenges from the states, especially some southern states who had tried to rescind or never ratified at all. Mm-hmm. So like Alabama. And so there's still going to be challenges in courts. So it would be better if the Senate passed SJ Res 6. That would be the best opportunity for us to say, well, it was allowed in the past for Congress to eliminate the deadline or to extend the deadline. So now they've eliminated it. Therefore, it's added to the Constitution. That will, and because most likely the Supreme Court or whatever court's going to view this is going to say, this is a congressional decision. Courts don't have there's no mentions of courts in Article 5. Congress passes the amendment. So if they want to add an extension or a removal, they're probably going to kick it back to Congress. And so if we've already done it, then it would hold stronger.
Who's your favorite local elective to work with? Are you from the Springfield area? Where are you from?
I'm from the Kansas City area.
Oh, okay.
Representative Judy Morgan in Kansas City is, we get to spend more time with her because she's here locally, but she's a huge champion of the ERA, and Jill Shoup as well. And we've been able to do like some panel events and other stuff together when we're not working. And so just connecting with them and their time commitment to the ERA. But there are many others and co-sponsors that have supported it. But it's amazing. You get to have relationships with senators and representatives that have passed it in other states. That, like, we had a representative from Illinois, a Republican, come to speak at our last rally. And so he talks about why it shouldn't be partisan and why it's just common sense. And so the relationships that you build across state lines has been pretty fun too.
Wow, that's really inspiring. We do have a chat from one of our students, actually the vice president of Politically Active, Cooper. He asks, what section of society do you feel the ERA is needed most in or would benefit the most?
I think definitely women in poverty, women who are only earning, if we think about Latina women, Hispanic women that earn about 50 cents to a white man's dollar. We're talking about, taking care of your families and just living in abject poverty and working really tough jobs where you're also going to be more susceptible to sexual harassment or violence. And, it's going to be hard to navigate all of that. And then Black women, women of color, they're all paid less than even white women. So I think the poorest women in our society that are more victimized, less believed in every aspect of their life, they're the ones who need it the most. And so really Black women have been the leaders in Virginia, Nevada, leading the charge, the leader of the ERA coalition, National ERA Coalition. And so they're the ones pushing it forward and really leading us through this. Because when you think about a lifetime of being underpaid, you have less money saved for retirement. You have less access to healthcare. Your 401k, if you're lucky to even have one, is less. And so your quality of life is drained, and it's unfair. It's sex-based discrimination.
Thank you for that. Do we have any more questions, guys, for Erica? Since it isn't a partisan amendment, why would anyone besides men want to prevent this amendment?
Again, I think it's mainly the way that right now the big thing is abortion. I mean, that's what they say, at least. I mean, people may have other qualms against, women fighting for, potentially the opportunity to fight against all these other things we've been talking about. But the thing they say now is like, well, if it's going to expand abortion, I oppose abortion, and then I don't have to discuss it anymore. It's just the easiest thing to quiet everybody and say, nope, 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 nope. I'm not a part of this. And they don't want to be held accountable to those organizations where, if it is passed and something were to happen, they'd be like, you supported this happened to you. But in other states, like in Illinois, that was the situation where they were just a few votes away. And after it had passed, a lot of other Republicans in the chamber clicked yes. They changed their vote to yes when they saw that it already passed, because they didn't want their daughters to look at them differently, or their granddaughters. So in a lot of their heart of hearts, I think they know it's the right thing, but some of them are just so driven by maintaining power and holding their position that they choose to not do the right thing.
Erica, what's the best way to contact you? Does your organization have a website if anyone wanted to look up more information?
Yeah, if you go to project28mo.com, we have a website overflowing with information and pictures of our events and other things that have happened. And then our email is project28mo@gmail.com. Those are the best ways. And there's also a phone number on our website if you want to just directly call us. And there's a way to sign up for our newsletter, and if you want to volunteer. So we would love to hear from anybody who's interested in learning more or collaborating.
Sure, that's great, and that's wonderful information. I'd encourage anyone with questions to follow up and reach out to Erica with anything at that email. Also, if you're interested in joining Politically Active, you can search the OTC website for student organizations, Politically Active, or email Andrew Crocker or myself at any time. We're so glad to have hosted you tonight, and thank you for sharing this Constitution Day on this amazing topic and sharing your insights with us.
Thank you again. This was so great. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you, everyone, and we will see you next time. Thanks, Erica.
Bye.